Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, and my colleague, Russell Berger, both attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act and exemption status. So just kind of as a starting point, whenever we talk about the FLSA, we are often talking about classification and whether an employee is exempt or non-exempt. And kind of as the words indicate, an exempt employee is an exemption to the rule, right? So most employees are standardly going to be hourly employees unless they meet an exemption. They're going to be a non-exempt employee unless they meet an exemption test, which we're going to talk about today. And even some people that an employer might be paying salary could possibly be also non-exempt and not meet an exemption test. So the baseline is unless you do the test, you assume that they don't meet the exemption, but you got to run every employee through the test. So what's the test, and what do you have to be thinking about, Russell, when we're talking about these things?
Yeah, so what really brought this topic back to the forefront is a recent Supreme Court decision where the Supreme Court dealt with the highly compensated exemption, which is its own complicated exemption. There's a whole suite of exemptions called the white collar exemptions, highly compensated, professional, administrative, executive exemptions all fall kind of in that grouping. And the highly compensated exemption basically applies when the salary is sufficiently high, but the job duties function doesn't clearly make out the one of the other white collar exemptions. So to back up a step, as you were alluding to, Sarah, there's two components to any exemption or any of the white collar exemptions. There's do the job duties that the person is performing meet this test, and are they paid on a salary basis a sufficient amount to qualify? And with one caveat to that for certain hourly rate professionals. We'll leave that aside for the moment. But the real issue here that the Supreme Court dealt with was a purportedly highly compensated exempt employee was being paid a day rate would have satisfied the weekly salary basis component. But the Supreme Court said that wasn't sufficient to satisfy the salary basis test because it was a day rate and not a weekly guaranteed salary. So one of the really important takeaways, besides the fact that you shouldn't pay highly compensated employees a day rate because the Supreme Court won't recognize that as sufficient for the exemption, is that regardless of the type of exemption that you might be applying to any employee, you still have to make sure that their compensation is not only the sufficient amount, but being done in the proper mechanical, technical way to satisfy the exemption test.
Yeah, and as our viewers can already tell from this conversation, obviously these tests are not super straightforward. You can't just Google them and think you're set, right? And this is a good example. This case that Russell's referencing is a really good example of the nuance in the law as it relates to one part of the test. So the salary basis, I think a lot of employers can say, well, especially with a highly compensated employee like you're talking about, Russell, is that well, I pay them so much, it can't be an issue. Like I can't owe them overtime. This can't be a problem. And it feels wrong that wouldn't meet the test, right? And so this is a good example of where something that feels like you're doing the right thing could be technically incorrect and could get you in a lot of trouble.
Right. Well, and it's the problem is when you pay people more and you think that, as you gave that example, is that your exposure can be a lot higher because you're paying time and a half on the regular rate for overtime. When you pay someone more, that regular rate is going to be a lot higher than if you're paying someone minimum wage, for example. So if you think just because you're paying them a lot, they're exempt, then it really behooves you to take a closer look to make sure that that test is being satisfied.
Yeah, no, that's great advice and a great point, Russell. Well, thanks for that, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sarah.